Christ. And grace, peace, mercy, and love be yours from God our Creator, through Jesus our Savior, and through the Spirit who gathers us together. That little sentence in our gospel lesson has become the subject of a lot of cheap jokes, a lot of humor through the years. We have Simon and Andrew's at their place. Simon's mother-in-law is in bed with a fever. Jesus comes, what did I read? Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Now, it's real easy to make a joke there. The poor woman just got off of her sick bed. Couldn't Simon and Andrew for once have served the dinner themselves? Couldn't they have done something? We look at how this poor woman was basically being used or abused by her family. She got up and she immediately had to serve them. But that's not, I don't believe, what the point of that passage. Those who are sick, Jesus comes to with compassion. Jesus comes to those who are in need. Later on in our lesson, we heard how Jesus went and took care of people in the whole town, and then was ready to move on to other towns to do the same. Jesus comes to us with compassion, and Jesus heals us with compassion and calls us to rise up and serve others. We are healed not to our own glory and not to our own self-serving interest, but to serve others. Isn't that the point of the gospel? Of all of the scriptures, we are called to love and serve others. And keeping that in mind, there's a line in the second lesson as Cheryl read it. I hope that it caught your attention. St. Paul wrote, "I have become all things to all people." A lot of people don't know that line is in the Bible. Some years ago, that wasn't that many years ago, I was at an ordination service for a good friend of mine, being ordained in a church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he had so many clergy friends that he liked. It was like the world's longest ordination service. There were 2 preachers. There were 2 of everything. It was like Noah's Ark, 2 by 2 by 2. We did everything. And one of the 2 preachers, service also took like 2 hours plus, like 2 by 2 by 2. The one preacher, and I forget which one it was giving his words of wisdom to my friend. He said, "Remember, you can't be all things to all people." Now, this was in a pre-smartphone age. Those of you who know me well know what I would have done immediately when I heard the phrase, "You're not to be all things to all people." I would have whipped out my phone, boom, 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 pull up Ormus Bible browser, boom, boom, there it would be, and I showed it to a friend. I would have showed it to a friend who was with me. Instead, this was a pre-smartphone age. I reached for the Bible, the Pew Bible, and showed it to him. "I have become all things to all people." Most people don't know that line is in the scriptures. They would have guessed it's the opposite. You can't be all things to all people. But Paul is telling us, and he gave us a list. To the Jews I became as a Jew. To those under the law I became as one under the law. To those outside I became outside. To those who were weak I became weak. That's exactly what Paul meant. We are called to become all things to all people. And in our age where we center so much upon ourselves, and we hear all the seminars and things on TV telling us to be our most self-actualized self and to be whole and integrity with ourselves, we're always talking about ourselves. Paul's talking about being something for other people. Like Simon's mother-in-law, we are called to get up and serve other people. Now, what Paul is saying is we don't sell ourselves out. We don't lack authenticity in what we do. This passage this morning from first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, and in a very short while, in that 1 Corinthians, Paul is going to talk about love. Paul always talked about love. Of course, James, the epistles that James wrote, John wrote, always talk about love. Jesus always talked about love. Maybe it's rather basic to our faith to love one another as Christ has loved us, to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, to love our neighbor, to love God and to serve God. Always called to love. Seminary can be a very strange place. I remember, I loved it when I was there. I always knew it was not the real world, but it was a nice place to be for a couple of years. And sometimes it was really hard to have conversations with people. You might talk about a new song that had come out on the radio. Say, oh, have you heard Elton John's latest? And there'd always be somebody who would say, I don't listen to that type of music. Oh, aren't you cool? That still happens. Somebody will say, did you see this? Did you see Survivor, American Idol on TV last night? I don't watch those types of shows. We all know people who do that, right? They're a little bit above the rest of us. I'll tell you a secret. I've never watched more than 5 minutes of Survivor, and I don't think I've watched more than 7 minutes of American Idol. But I'm called to be all things to all people. And if I encounter somebody in my ministry who wants to talk about those, I'm going to be prepared. I've watched the 5-7 minutes of each, so I'd have an idea of what was going on. When Survivor was at its heyday, I used to cut out the article from the paper of who all the contestants were, and I'd mark week by week, because the newspaper would have that information. So if somebody wanted to talk about Survivor, I would not be able to say, I don't watch that show. I go, yeah, wasn't it amazing that one person was kicked off last week? I didn't think she'd be kicked off so soon. Because you've got to enter into people's lives where they are. It's not that hard. And the greatest thing is I've learned so much. People who do all kinds of hobbies and fascinating things and have interest in life, if we're not busy telling them what we don't do, but we enter into their experience, into their stories, we learn. I've learned, if I can learn, anybody can learn so much more than we know. Because there is so much more to know than what is within us. And it also takes some study on our part. I don't know, where was the point in life that most of us decided we didn't need to learn much new, that we knew it all. I experienced that a lot with some folks, oftentimes within the clergy. They keep wanting to learn the same things over and over and over. Paul wrote, to the Jews I became a Jew. To those under the law I became as one under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law. To the weak I became weak. That last one is kind of easy to understand. When we serve people who are suffering, when we serve people who are mourning, when we serve people who are in pain, to enter into their experience and understand that and relate to them on that level, as opposed to not understanding them. That one comes to us easily. In this last week, we've had a lot of things going on in the world. And having to go to Chicago to do the funeral of my aunt. And she's one of the greatest people I ever knew for learning things from. I learned a lot of things from her because I'd just be with her and enter into her world, which is a fascinating world. Catching all the news that's going on in the world. And it has not been a very pretty week in news. It's been rather ugly. A lot of consternation and a lot of yelling, a lot of hollering, a lot of death, a lot of violence. And we can say, if we are people of the Bible, what's new? We know this is always taking place and always happening. But what happens if Paul would have said, to the Muslims I became as a Muslim? I hear a lot of people talking about relationships with Muslims, and I don't know if they understand the first thing about Islam. Could we, if someone Islamic walked in this room, could we relate, as Paul says, to a Muslim? We became as a Muslim and understood what they're talking about? Probably not. Because we haven't taken the time to know, to love them, to get to know them. I'm going to share with you one thing. Their critique of our culture was never they hated our freedoms. I mean, that's absurd. What it was is they hate our culture. Not all Islam, but particularly those who are poor, those who are on the lower end of society's ladder. And they hate our culture. And with good reason. And when I tell you the reason, you might all agree too. I find you have a lot in common with Islamic fundamentalists. Our use of women. Can you watch TV for more than an hour? Can you read a magazine? Can you read the newspaper without seeing nearly naked women being used to advertise this, that, or the other thing? Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition is coming out. Everybody's going to run out and buy that magazine. We use a lot of discussion in the media. Who's going to be the nearly naked woman we have on cover this year? We use nearly naked women to advertise just about anything and everything in this world. That's why in very conservative Islam a woman wears the whole garb. Because they don't want their women being objectified. They don't want their women being held up nearly naked to be used to sell products for commercial interests, for material things, out of respect for the women. And there they are very similar to the Amish. The Amish all dress head to toe. Again, because they don't want any improper display of the human body. And they don't want their women being used. In Hasidic Judaism, the same thing. In Hasidic Judaism, they also wear head to toe. And the women there wear wigs. On the day of their marriage, they put on a wig because their hair is considered to be so beautiful that only their husband should see it. It's with great respect for women that people in other places and other cultures do different things than we do. And sometimes I really think that they're right. Not that I believe in making women wear something head to toe. But they have a critique of our society, of our materialism, of our use of people to sell products for material gain, for commercialism. That is where we have one major source of conflict. Jesus called us to rise up and serve others, not hate others. Paul says, become all things to all people. Know what's going on in the lives of others. Understand where they are coming from. Be able to engage in conversation, in meaningful exchange of conversation, communication, because to the Jews, I became a Jew. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. To the Muslims, I became as a Muslim. Didn't say I became a Muslim, but as a Muslim, as a Jew, as those outside the law, so that I can know them and understand them and we can begin to talk. And we might find we have much more in common than we think and find a way out of all of the difficulties and pain and suffering and violence this world is experiencing. I become all things to all people. We must know all people. Christ raises us up like Peter's mother-in-law raises us up to serve other people, and to serve those people with love,